Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Osborne Clarke webinar. Today, we're going to be focusing on how to get ahead in your law applications. So just to give some brief introductions to our speakers, my name's Zoe. I'm the Graduate Recruitment Manager at Osborne Clarke, and my role is to be involved in all of the recruitment and selection of our trainee solicitors. And I'm joined today by two of our trainees, so I'll hand over to them so that they can introduce themselves.
Hi, yes, so I'm Adam. I'm a third seat trainee. I'm currently in the corporate M&A and PE teams, and in my first seat I did planning, and then in my second seat I did banking and finance.
Hi, I'm Iman. I'm also in my third seat and in the London office with Adam. And my first seat was equity capital markets, which is part of our corporate team. My second was planning, and I'm currently in the financial institutions group team, which covers a few different things.
Great, thanks very much. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, as you'll see from this list, we're going to give you a little bit of background about Osborne Clarke as a business, and then really focus in on our application process, what we're looking for in our application form, some hints and tips from Adam and Aman on what they did when they were going through the process, and then finally some hints and tips for the assessment centre process and interviews, and then we'll save lots of time at the end for questions. On that note, if you do have questions for us throughout the session, please do feel free to pop them into the question box, and as I say, we'll scoop up all of those questions at the end of the session, so please do fire away as we are going through the slide deck. So in terms of Osborne Clarke, who are we as a business? So from this slide, you can see that we are an international law firm. So not just based here in the UK, but have a strong presence throughout Europe, Asia, and also some offices in the US, which allows us to service clients internationally, not just on a national basis. And we work predominantly across 8 key sectors. So the biggest of these sectors is probably around real estate and infrastructure, tech, media and comms, and energy and utilities, with other significant sectors being financial services, retail and consumer, and transport and automotive. And one of the key focuses of the firm are around the drivers of transformation. So looking at where the sectors cross over with each other has really brought about these 3 key drivers that we're really focusing on with our clients and advice at the moment. So focusing on digitalisation, decarbonisation and urban dynamics. If you're interested in any of those particular streams, please do head over to the Osborne Clarke website because there's a wealth of information there. And we'll come on to that as one of our hints and tips for your application research as we go through this session. So what actually does the application process involve at Osborne Clarke? So I've broken down on this slide that there are 3 key components to our application process. The first stage is an online application, which encompasses both an online application form and an online verbal reasoning test. We are currently accepting applications for our 2022 process, and the deadline for applications within this cycle is the 15th of January 2022. From that stage, we will select a certain number of people to come through to a stage 2, which is an assessment centre. Our assessment centres are normally comprised of group exercises, panel interviews with our partners, and the Watson Glaser test. And depending on the circumstances that we find ourselves under, this will either be done virtually or hopefully getting back to in-person assessments as well, to really help candidates to get more of an insight into us as a firm and the kind of environment that you would be working in. We also have a third stage to our selection process. So whilst it's not mandatory to complete a vacation scheme with us, we do recruit really heavily through that process because we find it's a 2-way street. So it allows you to really get under the skin of the firm and to experience life as a trainee solicitor, and for us to see how you work within our environment as well. So that 2-week work experience placement normally takes place over the summer break, and as it says, gives you the opportunity to work as a trainee within our business. As I mentioned, that section is not mandatory for applying and getting a training contract at Osborne Clarke. So if you were only applying through the straight training contract route, it would just be the 2 stages. So stage 1, the online application, and stage 2 as the assessment centre. And what we're going to do is talk you through each of these stages in turn, and giving you some practical hints and tips as you're going through the process. So focusing first on stage 1, which is the online application process, what exactly is it that we're looking for candidates to deliver in this stage? And I think at this stage, first and foremost, we're really looking to get to know you, and find out what it is that motivates you and drives you. So we want to know, a little bit about your commercial and business awareness. Do you understand what it is to be a lawyer? Do you understand what law firms are there to achieve? We also want to know your motivations for pursuing a legal career, because it takes a long time to qualify as a lawyer. So it's really important that you're invested and that you understand exactly what the role is, and what you're going to be expected to do as a qualified solicitor. One of the most important things that we're assessing in the online application stage is your writing style. Obviously, at that stage, we haven't had any verbal interactions with you. So the emphasis really is on making sure that you have a very clear and succinct writing style, and that we can understand from the first read through of your submission exactly what it is that you're trying to explain to us. So the very first thing that you need to do before you've even looked through the application form is to really focus in on your preparation. So I'm going to hand over to Adam and Iman to run you through their tips for preparing.
Yeah, so I mean, from my perspective, I think, as it says on the slide, doing your research is super, super important. So the first port of call is the Osborne Clarke website, and kind of understanding there what's on it, what Osborne Clarke does, what makes them different from other law firms. And there are all sorts of kind of other resources you can use, like Chamber Student and Legal Cheek, or kind of other legal magazines. And so it's important to understand, what the firm does, and relay that in your application. And I've also, I also think it's quite helpful and it's helpful when choosing what law firm you want to apply to understand the types of work that Osborne Clarke do. So absolutely looking at recent, press pieces, and seeing if you're interested in the type of work that Osborne Clarke do. And then kind of connecting that to your personal ambitions. Why does that piece of work interest you, and why does the work that Osborne Clarke do interest you? That's definitely how I approached it. I don't know, Mine, if you approached it differently, or.
No, I think that makes a lot of sense. I'd echo what you said, and I'd also just say to not try and say everything in one go, because even when you reach the firm, you're not going to try every single little thing. So you don't have to try and put all parts of the firm into your application, and it comes across, I think, maybe a bit more genuine. If you just choose those which actually do stand out to you, you can say why, you can tie in the different things that you might have experienced, or the different jobs you might have had that have led you to that being interesting. And then once you've sort of narrowed down the why, it makes it a lot easier to research and follow up on different parts of it, different trends. And I'd also really recommend just keeping quite a good note of things as you go. Just, it doesn't have to be really formal, but like a mind map, or like a quick note to all the links, or some kind of index, something that means that when it's time to get writing and preparing for interviews, hopefully, you can just go back to that quite easily.
Fab. Some great tips in there. So once you've done your preparation and you've decided which firms it is that you're interested in applying to, you should then have a look through the application form. Every firm will have slightly different application forms, so it's really important to spend some time researching into the questions and really thinking about what you're going to cover in your answers. But you must always remember that the application form is really your opportunity to tell us about you. So you need to have a think about what makes you you, what things are important to you, what your motivations are, because that's really what we're looking for you to convey in the application form. Um, on this slide, you'll see I've put that the basics are really important. And if ever people are asking me for my top tips on when you're filling in an application form, I always say, remember to check that your contact details are correct. Because every year I will invite people to an assessment centre, but they've inputted their email address incorrectly, or they've missed a digit out of their telephone number, which makes it incredibly difficult for us to give you that opportunity if we can't get hold of you. So please do make sure that your contact details are correct. It's also really important that you enter academics and work experience actually in a chronological order. So, when you're going through your application form, quite often people will say to us that they're very structured and organised in their approach to work. And then you look at the work experience section and it's all a little bit random depending on when you've done it and how you've tried to factor it into the form. So just showing that you do possess that logical and structured approach to your work is really important. So make sure that you add those in chronological order. It's important as well to remember that we're not expecting you to present as fully qualified lawyers. We're not expecting you to know the legal position on anything, and legal work experience is incredibly difficult to come by. So at Osborne Clarke, we're not even expecting you to come with legal work experience. For us, the emphasis is absolutely on transferable skills. So what have you done in your studies or your work life that are going to really help you become a successful lawyer? What skills and attributes do you have and can bring to the firm? And that's really where the bulk of your submission should focus, not just on legal work experience, because that's not a requirement. So how can you evidence the skills that you've got to be a successful lawyer? So again, handing over to Adam and Aman to talk you through how they decided the best bits to pop into their application forms to get them to where they are today.
So I think we both agreed when we were discussing this that it really doesn't just have to be legal, particularly at the stage that you do apply for a back scheme or training contract. You might not have had a lot of legal experience. And I think if you remember that being a lawyer is kind of like a client customer service job, it makes it feel a lot broader. And then when you think about the areas of law that are covered in the sort of different businesses, a lot more experience might become relevant. So whilst a lot of my experience was sort of in debating, mooting side of things, any like jobs, like I worked at a gym, but that was client facing and you had to manage people's expectations if things went wrong and respond to situations as they arose. And that's all stuff that definitely comes up now in day to day. Volunteering, I think, is great because it kind of shows where your interests are, and firms aren't just what the legal work is. We have loads of kind of volunteering and pro bono stuff going on here too, and you can bring your own. So if that's something that interests you, definitely draw that out. I think anything that you particularly enjoyed, even if it seems really kind of remote, if there's something like a skill that you've learned from it or a piece of information that you've learned from it and developed, that shows the part of you that you can then bring to a business, I think. So that would be my advice.
Yeah, and I completely agree with that. Everything, put everything that you can think of that be relevant, put it down. I mean, things like sports clubs or any sort of club that, maybe you've had some sort of experience in, managing people or liaising with other people or being organized and kind of coordinating that around your academic work. That's all super valuable experience and is very transferable to being a lawyer as well. So you probably it's probably a lot easier to kind of show you have those skills than you might think at first. So definitely have a think about what you've been doing and see how what sort of skills you can draw out from those.
Yeah, and I was also going to add, if there's, even if it's something that perhaps you followed up on your own that's not within an organized, like a group or a society, if you've are particularly interested in a certain topic and you followed that up throughout your life because that's your interest, you can definitely relate something like that back to. And it says the virtual events on there, I'd really recommend saying that you've turned up to things, that you've heard from people at the firm about the firm itself, because it shows that you've actually shown an active interest, and then you have a lot of material there to draw on.
Yeah, definitely. The virtual events have been a fantastic opportunity to engage with a much wider group of people because you've removed geography as a barrier. So please do make the most of the virtual events and go along and meet people, because that's really how you're going to get a feel for the kind of firm that you ultimately want to apply to and work for. So another key part of our application form is focused around competency questions. So these are the kinds of questions where you're asked to describe a time that you participated as part of a team, or talking us through your motivations and interests. And there's some tips just here to help you form your answers for the competency questions, because these in particular do follow quite a structured answer. And there's a technique called the STAR technique that we'll run through in a moment that will really help you to put forward the best response to these kinds of questions. But in the run up to that, it's really important when you're writing your answers for competency questions to really focus in on the why. So quite often when I'm reading application forms, you get lots of information about what people have done, what the team's been involved with, what the task was, but with very little evidence of what that individual's role was within that team, and no summary at the end of the why. Why were you doing that? Why did you need to achieve these things? Why is that important? So whenever you're going through these questions, always make sure that the why is included within your submission, because that's what's really going to get you the top marks and to really help you to stand out in the competency questions. As I've mentioned, it's also really important to focus on you. So particularly within team working examples, people will use we rather than I. And remember, it's important to showcase that you can work as part of a team, but we're really looking to get to know you and what value you added to that team. So always bring the answer back to you and what you brought and what you delivered. So here's some more information on the STAR technique that I mentioned. And this is a really great framework for completing your competency questions. And as somebody who reviews competency questions and all of the applications that come in, it's a structure that I find really helpful to help me work out if a candidate has covered all of the key points that we would expect them to within their answers. So the STAR stands for the situation, the task, the action, and the result. So setting the scene, telling us what the task was, what did you have to achieve, the action, so what did you do, the important emphasis there being on you, and what happened in the end. And it doesn't have to be a positive outcome, and I think this is where sometimes a negative outcome is more demonstrative of what you've done, because you've learned something from it, and it's that reflection piece where you've said we haven't quite got there, but next time we did this and it was a much stronger example. So don't be afraid to use negatives. We're not expecting you to be perfect 100% of the time. The other kinds of questions that we have within our application form are focused around commercial awareness. And if anyone's logged into the form this year, so our 2021-22 cycle, these are the questions that we're asking candidates to think about and put forward their views on. So as you can see, the key emphasis is on the here and now. So what's going on in the business world? What does the firm need to do to embrace what's happening? What do we need to adapt to? What do clients need to adapt to? How do we need to change to move our business forward? And again, these kinds of questions do require quite a lot of research and preparation. And Adam and Aman will take you through some tips for approaching these questions, because I think these are often the ones that people get a little bit stuck on, or perhaps don't quite know where to start.
Yeah, for sure. And Yeah, I mean, when Aman and I were talking about this as well, this is something that we both agreed was, I mean, it's difficult. It's difficult to know because you're not doing it day to day. But I think the best thing to do is to just keep kind of reading the news and keep on top of current affairs as well. And then when it comes to putting it into the application form, you kind of have to consider what how it might be relevant to Osborne Clarke's business in particular, and whether that be kind of big picture commercial shifts or small pieces that might be relevant on a client by client basis. I think both of those are really helpful. So I mean, just as a kind of context, it is really important for lawyers to be commercially aware because, for example, if you're drafting a contract, you need to tailor it to your client, and you don't want, if your client is a media and tech business and they don't have any property, you don't want loads of clauses in that contract that just deals with property. So it's important to understand the client's business and to be really commercial when thinking about problems as well. And also kind of, it can be anything that the issue that you're looking at. So, for example, in the kind of world as it is as the moment, people buy more online. Their spending habits are changing, and kind of having a think about what impacts that could have on all parts of the supply chain, for example. So it's looking at things like that you might already know are happening, but kind of considering how they might affect Osborne Clarke and their clients as well.
Yeah, I definitely echo what Adam said. And the thing about just keeping on top of the news is a really good tip because you can just do it daily or, every couple of days. And something that I found personally really useful is if you have access to the Financial Times, maybe through your universities, they do really good summaries which you click. So it's almost delivered to you. You don't even have to seek it out. And even in my job now, the trainees send around a Financial Times update to the rest of the team, just saying this is what's going on in the news. So it remains relevant that you kind of know what's going on, and you can choose, as we said before, you can choose what interests you. You don't have to have a working knowledge of every single area of the news. But if you kind of want to be a lawyer and you have an idea of what kind, then that's the kind of route that you can follow up. And I'd say with commercial awareness, it's sort of just putting law into the real world slightly, because otherwise we'd just be practicing law and just saying the laws again and again, and they wouldn't be kind of molded to who we're actually trying to give the law to, because the way you represent the law really does vary depending on what's happening. So we mentioned like how it might affect the clients. It also could affect Osborne Clarke as a law firm. We could also think about like the different things that are offered from Osborne Clarke. Like we have something called OC Solutions, which is actually really, really useful and like moves things forward quite a lot. I used it today. So anything about tech, legal tech, especially if a firm is holding itself out to be particularly good at something, following up what that thing is in the market means you'll have a knowledge of what the firm is good at. And an example of like something that I saw was when I started as a trainee, it was during the second lockdown, and it was there was loads of online shopping, all the shops were closed, and that meant that the fashion business, the online fashion business, was doing really, really, really well. It was just like exploding, and all like the loungewear was exploding because everyone was at home. And I was going through all these stats, and it was like, look at the sale of our like tracksuit bottoms, they've like quadrupled. And so to have an awareness of that, the team that I was working in was like, this is going to be a growing trend. All the marketing was pitched around the fact that COVID has meant people have moved to shopping online. So they really wanted to get that work, which they did, so that they could show other clients in the market, actually, we're really used to dealing with this kind of thing, and we're used to being on top of this change that's come as a result of COVID. And I think we all kind of know bits of information, like the fact that things like that have happened, trends like that have happened. So it's just thinking about how a firm could use them and how the clients might see them.
Yeah, and sorry, I've just seen a question that, other than the Financial Times, are there any other sources of news? I mean, any source of news, any newspaper, any online kind of reputable source of online news is good. You don't have to diligently sit there and read the FT cover to cover, or every single article every day, or get the Economist and scroll through that. No, it's not what it's about. It's about kind of understanding the trends that are going on in the world, or at least finding something that you might be interested in, and kind of thinking about how that how that might affect Osborne Clarke and its clients.
I definitely echo the interest part. Like, find something that you want to read, and then it will not be too laborious to read it and follow it and find out about it. I think if you're forcing yourself to read something you're truly not interested in, it's always going to be a bit painful. The other thing I'd recommend is finding slightly slower news sites. I say the ones that I use, but I'm sure there's others. I use one called Tortoise. I don't even know if that's how you pronounce it, but it digest things slower, and it looks at overall market trends, overall patterns, and it means it's not just a daily kind of bulletin, it's kind of a bit more big picture. Or you get long reads on like The Guardian. Just anything which kind of like looks at the bigger picture, I think, is really useful for adding to your own context, and then gives you leads to follow up on as well.
Are there any, showing my ignorance here, is there a quick way, presumably, that can you set up Google alerts for news articles to be pushed to you, so you don't actively need to go out and seek that information? Is that a good way of getting stuff delivered to you as well?
Do you know, you can, and I actually also use Instagram a lot, because I find it like a really accessible way to get my news, and then you can follow the links. And basically, I think if you use something that you are familiar with, you kind of know the information comes to you in a way that you're happy to receive it. So I found following like the news organizations on Instagram really helpful. You can just scroll through the posts, and then it's right there for you, all sort of nicely formatted. And things like Google Alerts, signing up for emails, free trials. Your universities will probably be signed up to a lot of newspapers and magazines and things. So those kind of sources are really helpful.
Instagram's a good one. I agree with that.
That's how I get all my news now.
Yeah. Well, it's just so easy, isn't it? Just scroll.
Yeah, and it's formatted like to be easily accessible. You just see the picture, you see the headline, you've got the link. It's like very easy on the eye.
Yeah. Bro. So once you've done all of your research, you've found your commercial awareness topics, you've nailed your submission, there's just a few final touches that we'd recommend to people before they click submit on their application forms. And these are really just proofreading points, but they're so important, because as we've discussed throughout the course of this session so far, it's really important that lawyers prepare factually correct and succinct documentation for clients. So we have very similar expectations when it comes to application forms, particularly around accuracy of information and typos. So my top tip is always to ask somebody else to read through your whole submission. And that includes the work experience and the academic section as well, to check for errors. I know when I'm writing copy, I get so involved in the written submission that often I will misspell things, or some things don't make sense. So having somebody else review my work before it goes live just means that it can be looked at with that fresh pair of eyes. Another thing you could do would be to read it out loud, because you'll find that if the submission is not particularly fluent and you're struggling to read it out loud, that it means you probably need to take a second look at the structure of the paragraphs. As Aman mentioned earlier, research and write about things that you're genuinely interested in. We're looking for people who are really passionate and motivated to work in the law for the kind of clients that we work with. So if you're doing things in the space that you have a genuine interest and passion in, that genuinely comes across even in written submissions. Take your time. So as I've mentioned, our application form is open until the middle of January. So there is plenty of time for you to do your research and for you to construct some really strong answers. But on the flip side, don't leave your submission until the last day, just in case you get any technical issues with the platforms. And most importantly, remember to be yourself throughout all of these processes. We really want to learn about you as an individual. So it's really important that if a friend or a family member picked up your application form and read through it, that they would say that that was a fair reflection of you. So remember to be yourself. That's so important in these processes. We're looking to get to know you a little bit better. So using all of our hints and tips, you've nailed the application process, and now you're moving into the assessment centre phase. So as I mentioned earlier on, at Osborne Clarke, our assessment phase includes group exercises, interviews, and we also use the Watson-Glaser test at this stage as well. We would hope to normally run assessment centres in person, but obviously due to the pandemic and the social distancing guidelines, we have been running things virtually and envisage that our 2022 cycle will run virtually as well, at least for the assessment centre phase. So we've also included some tips for virtual interviews at the end of the session. But now just moving into what it is that we're looking for at the assessment centre phase. So this is really your opportunity to meet people from the firm and to really convey across to us your interest in the law. Talk to us about your commercial awareness and the things that you are interested in. And we're really looking to get to know you a little bit better in these processes. So bringing your best self to the assessment centre is absolutely recommended. So again, handing over to Adam and Aman to talk you through some kind of top tips for preparing for an assessment centre.
So I think going back slightly to when I said preparing generally for the application, that would be really useful as well for the assessment centre, and that's kind of why it's handy to keep a note. And what I did was just kind of almost summarise my what I was interested in, what my application said, put it all on 1 or 2 pages into, I always work off mind maps, but however works for you, and then just look over it in the days coming up to it, so you've kind of got all that information consolidated in your head, and maybe see if anything's moved on so that you can talk about latest trends, but don't worry again about trying to like fit too much into it. Just go over what you've kind of said you're interested in, see if anything new's happened, and I think if you identify what it is and why it is that you are interested in those things, and then equally how that's applicable to Osborne Clarke, that will be a good start for an answer.
Yeah, and definitely something I think I think it's really helpful to actually practice saying things out loud, not necessarily rehearsing answers, but even just practice getting people to practice asking you questions and talking through them, because I know certainly for me at least, sometimes if I don't have if I don't have a clear idea of what I want to say, it ends up becoming rambly, and you don't end up giving a clear answer. So I think definitely practicing, talking through what's in your application can be really helpful, at least just to get you into the kind of swing of talking about yourself, because it's not something that always comes naturally to people talking about yourself. It definitely doesn't for me. So I think that's really helpful.
Yeah, and I just seen the final bullet point there, and also about the language on the day, the question there. I think it is important, kind of think from the moment you walk through the doors, not that you always have to like be scrutinizing yourself, but like this is a professional kind of process, and it's important to kind of be in your professional mode, just in the same way that like when I turn up to work, I have a professional mode, like the clothes we wear, the way we speak to each other. So as long as you're in that mode, it's fine to be friendly and fine to be yourself, but just to be kind of aware that you're kind of in an office trying to represent yourself as a future lawyer, and to kind of be guided by that. The other thing I definitely recommend is to run your own race in the day, because you're going to be sitting with if it's virtual, you'll be working with other people, maybe in group exercises and things like that. don't be thrown by if there's something going on in your group exercises, someone else's personality that's throwing you a bit, or something that someone else is doing. Just really do focus on yourself, because I think it's quite easy to get distracted, especially in quite a high stakes like an assessment centre. But as long as you kind of do your own thing, show that you can respond and adapt, and don't worry about trying to account for other people's behaviour, and just kind of take a positive approach to things. Support people where you need to. Like, you don't need to cut people out of things or anything. I'm not suggesting anyone would, but supporting people will not hurt your own chances. So just kind of take the approach that maybe you would take if you were at the firm working in a team, and that should be a good way to approach.
That's really good advice, particularly in relation to group exercises, because it's so easy to compare yourself to everybody else. But your advice, Aman, about running your own race is absolutely correct. Don't let other people put you off. You're in charge of your own destiny in these sessions. So remember that as you're going through the assessment day. Be true to yourself, and you really can't go far wrong from that. So how can you prepare for the assessment centre? I think Adam and Aman have already covered a number of these points already. So just making sure that you're familiar with all of your research that you've done so far, checking back to see if there have been any developments since you submitted your application form, making sure you remember what you put in your application form, because that may be asked. It may be that someone who meets you over the course of the day has done something similar and they just want to have a conversation about your experience. Refamiliarizing yourself is really, really important, so that you can just bring the best version of yourself to the assessment centre. Some tips for interview here as well. So using the STAR technique that we talked about earlier might just help you to structure some of the answers that you think you might want to talk about. Being clear and concise is really important. And the tip at the bottom there about taking your time, perhaps take a sip of water to create a natural pause in the conversation, can be a really great space. We're not expecting you to think an answer straight away. Some of the questions that you'll find in interviews can be quite challenging. So it's okay to take your time, as long as that then means that you're presenting a clear and concise answer after you've taken that moment. Adam, Aman, do you remember your training contract interviews at OC? Are there any tips that you would give for that process? Because I know more often than not, people are particularly worried about interviews.
I kept a log of everything I'd done during the training contract, just like a tiny note to myself each day, looked over that before the interview, and it was really helpful because it's quite an intense process in terms of, you're meeting new people, you're looking at new work, and it's sometimes hard to remember exactly what it is that you liked and that you enjoyed. So I definitely say, like, think to yourself, what was good about this? What did I get out of this? What did I learn here? What did I like, dislike? Like, your kind of own perspective on your experience is useful, because that was something that was sort of that they asked in mine. And the other thing I would say is definitely that middle point: acknowledge if you don't know something, but attempt to answer. I had this in my interview, and I think it was quite a specific question. I really didn't know it, and there was no way that I could have ever made up the answer to it. And I don't think that's a bad thing, because it is quite obvious when people don't know things. And if you don't know, that is fine, because at our stage we don't know everything. It's just sort of about giving it a go. Why is the question asked? Can you think about the areas around it which might help you form a theory? And then just saying, could you tell me about it, and trying to follow up on it. And yeah, I think that's how I'd approach that one.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And I guess the main thing is just stay calm, because some people do really struggle with their nerves. I struggled with it a few times, and it's just important to keep calm and relax. No one's here to really try and trip you up. No one's ultimately people are trying to just to get to know you more as a person. And I know it's cliche, the just be yourself thing. And you know but it's just important to stay calm, and all they're trying to do is learn more about you. So just give them more of yourself, basically.
And if it's any help with the be yourself point, I've had circumstances, interviews where like I don't think me and the firm would have ended up suiting each other. And I'm glad that I kind of was myself, because it works out if you are. I think in the long run, it's kind of with a view to a job. So it's good to go into something being authentically how you want to present, because then you can act in line with that for the rest of your training contract and maybe beyond. So it's a good
Yeah,
start.
yeah, definitely. And I've noticed that, I mean, there are a few questions coming in, and I don't know whether I guess we can talk about them at the end, but I think there was just one that was, do you feel like the partners interviewers were generally creating a friendly environment? And, definitely here, absolutely. When I was in my OC interview, yeah, for sure. Like I said, they're just trying to get to know you as a person. And, people don't go into these things, at Osborne Clarke trying to be mean. Um, and I think that's one of the things that always stands out when you talk to people is, that you do feel like they create a friendly and welcoming environment.
That definitely was really obvious to me. And actually, I'd say on that, you can, that's not only is this an interaction of the firm with you, it's your interaction with the firm. So if an environment were to be created where you felt really put on the spot and really put in a corner, like that is also something to bear in mind when you're making your choice. But it's never something that I think I've come across at OC. Like both sorry, I think my internet just dropped out again. But also you can take it as a chance. Like if you're talking to a partner or an interviewer, they've been in the business, they know about the business, you can ask them about it as a bit of information for yourself. So if a partner introduces themselves and says, I'm in this area of law, or I'm really interested in this sector, you can ask them about it, because most likely they'll know some really interesting things. Might have seen some cool clients, cool developments. Like you can ask all that. It's quite a nice insight. So I take it like that too.
Yeah, definitely. The best way to approach an interview is to remember that it's a conversation where you're just telling somebody else about what you're interested in, and what makes you amazing. So I think if you can switch the pressure element off in your head and really think about how you can talk to somebody about the things that you're interested in, and ask questions of people if they have an insight into the things that you're interested in, and remember that it is just a conversation at the end of it. I think that does help to focus people and to settle some nerves going into the assessment process. Fab. So as promised, just a couple of top tips really for virtual interviews. So some of these things are, I suppose, a given that we've all been working on video conferencing for quite some time now, perhaps longer than we'd originally anticipated having to do it. So I'm sure you'll all be really familiar with the getting set up, testing audio, internet connections, lighting and backgrounds, etc. If you take anything away from this slide, I would say the most important things are not to multitask. So to remember to turn off mobile phones, not be distracted by WhatsApp or any other notifications that are coming through on various devices, and try not to read from your notes. We've noticed quite a significant number of people when we're interviewing have got notes, and it's great to have them so that you feel prepared. But remember that this is a conversation. It's not for you to just talk to us and run through some pre-prepared answers that you've already written down, in response to questions you think you might be asked, because it does make that conversation quite stilted, and it makes it quite difficult for you to engage with the interviewers and for it to take more of a conversation flow. So if you can minimize those notes, have them there as your safety blanket, but be confident in yourself and remember that it is a conversation. So try not to read from those notes. And I think that brings us to the end of the session. So thank you very much. At this stage, I think we shall go over to the question bar to run through some of the questions. Bear with me a second. There was one question here around sources. So other than the Financial Times, are there any other sources of news that you would recommend reading in order to improve commercial awareness?
You can find law specific resources online. I again will say Instagram. Like I would also actually, do you know what I'd recommend is like things like YouTube, even TikTok. There is actually really good stuff on there and really good info. So however you best like to take your information in, and feel free to incorporate social media into that. Like also the fact that what I did was get different newspapers apps. So instead of like when I got bored of my own like bedtime scrolling, I'd just flick over and it would be right there. So it doesn't have to be this really formal, like sitting at your desk with your computer or like the physical copy in front of you. That's, yeah, I hope that's helpful. That's some routes.
And what do you think separates Osborne Clarke from other international law firms?
A few things stood out to me personally, and they did actually stand out to me. I think one, the existence that there were some differences. Sometimes I felt like other international law firms were all saying they were different in the exact same way, and that in and of itself was put a bit of a question mark in my mind. And the things that stood out about OC were, everyone says it, but the culture is actually real. The fact that people are friendly to you and nice to you is really important. And as I've like started working, I've realized it's just not an optional extra, because these are the people that you are interacting with day in, day out, and they're giving you your work, they're giving you your feedback. If they are nice and can be bothered to give you good feedback, which they do and they are, then it makes it a much better training experience. So that was a big one for me.
Yeah, I mean, I completely echo the culture point. That was like absolutely key for me, you know, when I got into the VAT scheme as well, and then just the way that people were with you. Yeah, that absolutely key for me. And also, well, I mean, every firm, you know, does great work, but you know, actually being in some of the teams and then in you know certain sectors and markets, OC really are leading the way in certain areas, and it's great to be part of that type of work as well.
I remember we had a talk about how OC had sort of its history and its tech focus, its future focus, and I was like, this is A, interesting, and B, surely the way forward, because that's the direction we're headed. So it makes sense to kind of get a head start. And I think that's kind of reflected even in the fact that we have this 3D focus now, very like cohesive way of looking at what's coming next, how it suits clients, and we get kind of all sorts of talks on it. And I think it's a good way of gathering your kind of thoughts on something, and it makes you think about the area of law within which you're in a slightly different way, because it's quite clear. Like for example, the digitalization one I think is really important for like financial services, financial institutions, the kind of seat that I'm in at the moment, and the fact that it's talked about and discussed means that you think about it and you have an eye on it, which is good for your own career and learning.
Next question is, what advice would you give for a situation where you've got very little knowledge on the specific industry of a case study exercise? Don't know if you found
I
yourself in this
saw
situation.
I had done law at uni, so I was kind of, I had a bit of knowledge, but I did, in my group exercise, I saw that there was a few people who weren't as sure. And what I would say is, um, it really, I don't think it, I don't if I didn't find it was actually fundamental to have the exact industry knowledge, more that you had a sort of general working awareness of how companies work, how businesses in general work, what business priorities might be. The fact that it's using legal kind of language or like areas of law or anything like that is just because of, I think, maybe the world in which we're talking about. But if you peel back the law there and just look at it on a kind of company basis or something like that, don't get maybe diverted by the fact that the words law and the legal industry is being used, is how I think I'd approach.
Yeah, and I think it's quite a standard thing to give you something that, you know, the interviewers know you might not know, you probably won't know anything about, or might not even understand some of it. And I mean, to be fair, we didn't really touch on this earlier, but I do think it's helpful as part of the kind of general commercial awareness is to familiarize yourself with kind of certain commercial, commercial concepts. Just because ultimately, when you get situations like this, it's helpful to kind of understand it, and it doesn't look like everyone's speaking a foreign language. And ultimately, you'll come across these terms as well when you're going to be a lawyer, and so kind of having a base level understanding of them, I think demonstrates you're serious about it as well. So that is definitely something to try and get a grip of. But when you don't have any knowledge about something as well, that can be really helpful for grounding yourself as well.
I'd agree. I think that if I was to go back and change one, like how I prepared, I'd focus as well on like also to not get maybe sidetracked by what you know. So for example, if you are very aware of like corporate or commercial, what we do at this firm, there's like a whole range of things, and you can find that all on the website like reasonably easily, and click through and then read a little bit about each thing. It doesn't have to be a big exercise, but I think having like quite a holistic view of what the firm does is really helpful, because also a lot of the parts of the firm speak to each other at any one time. So it's not like we all kind of work separately. You might have someone in corporate talking to someone in tax, talking to someone in real estate. So there's a lot of links, and it's easier to see those links when you know what the different subjects are.
Great. Another question here. Does your perception as to what commercial lawyers do change once you've joined the firm and started training? So kind of expectation versus reality.
I think that's a really good question, actually, because, well, definitely before I did the VAT scheme, there I actually think that there's a bit of mystery about what do you actually do. You know, what does the job actually involve? And so, when you get into it, it you know it I mean, it depends on what your preconceptions are coming into it, to be honest. But certainly when you get into it, I think it's very interesting, and you definitely get far more involved in things than I ever thought I would as well. I don't know, Mum, whether you have any thoughts on that.
Yeah, I'd echo that. You do get involved almost from the word go. You're an employee and someone who's working in the team kind of as much as anyone else, and you have something to contribute to, and I think people do value your contribution. The other thing I'd say is to be aware of different kind of law practice styles, because so there's like kind of transactional work, which is where you're putting a transactional deal through and getting it moving to more sort of like an end goal, like things like M&A, equity capital markets, things like that. And then there's advisory work, which is where you are giving clients kind of ongoing advice. You're working with their business and you're kind of watching it grow and saying, if you do that, this will happen. If you do the other, then that will happen. And it's a bit more kind of like a dialogue rather than a deal. And then there's litigation, which is kind of like disputes and in court and things like that. And the style of law, I think, is quite personal, and that's what I found in my training contract. Is I didn't like every area, every type of law, every style of law, and it meant that as I went through my training contract, I could say, actually, I like advisory work. So finding that, as well as trying to be interested in the like the subject area and getting on with the team and things, is a really big thing that I didn't think of before I started. And the other thing I'd say is just, people say it, but how important it is that you are kind of like an advisor for clients in all circumstances, not just advisory work. Like, you work with them and with their business, and the advice you give them has to be useful for them kind of at all times. Otherwise, what are they really paying for? Like, just they don't want to know just what your general legal knowledge is. So the degree to which that is important is a big deal.
Great. And I don't know if either of you are involved in pro bono or CSR work. So there's a question just around that, the most memorable piece of work or something outside of the legal sphere that you've been involved with. Don't know if you can give an insight into that side of being a trainee at OC.
Yeah, I think our firm is really good at that actually, and puts its money where its mouth is. It doesn't just say it, it lets you do it, because they let us have a certain, they kind of just let us have a certain number of hours to do it in, which is good because not everyone does let you do that. So you kind of put it on the clock and it's recognized as valid as any other hours that you're spending doing kind of work. And there's a lot of different things to get involved in. So last year I did some appeals for personal independent payments, kind of like disability benefits and things like that, which was really hard. And the perk of that was that the outcome was really, really good. You had it's a huge amount of like exposure. You're handling documents, you're handling a case, you're handling a timeline. Like, it feels quite deep end, to be honest, and it feels like you are genuinely making a difference, and you are. Like, we won the appeal. We work with a really fantastic organization who does a really good job there, so that was really rewarding. And I volunteer at schools. I teach, like, you can go in school and kind of give assemblies and things about law, and I also brought my own volunteering that I had done previously before I started at the firm. All I had to do was say, this is what it is, this is the organization, can I do it? And they said yes, and then I go do that when I want to go do it. So I think it's a firm that's very, very open to volunteering pro bono.
Great. I think that brings us quite neatly to the end of the session, actually. Apologies if we haven't been able to get to your question. If you want to email me with any specifics directly, please feel free to do so. I'd be more than happy to take any questions offline. But thank you so much for listening to us talk about how to get ahead in your law applications and applying to Osborne Clarke. And huge thanks to Adam and Aman for talking us through their insights and their experiences as well. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Good luck.